The gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, turning every head in the small Wyoming town except for one. Yancy Aldridge didn't flinch, didn't blink, just raised the whiskey to his lips and drained the glass as though the sound of death was nothing more than a pesky fly buzzing in his ear. The year was 1876, and for a man like Yancy, violence had long since lost its ability to surprise. "You ain't even curious who caught a bullet this time?" asked the barkeep, a man named Silas who'd grown accustomed to Yancy's stone-faced presence these past 18 months. "Dead is dead," Yancy replied, pushing his glass forward for a refill. "Makes no difference to me who's doing the dying." The saloon doors swung open, bringing with them a swirl of dust and the town's sheriff, a portly man whose tin star seemed perpetually on the verge of falling off his sweat-stained shirt. "Aldridge," the sheriff nodded, approaching the bar. "Thought you might want to know it was Pete Holloway who got himself shot. Caught a bullet trying to stop a pair of bandits from robbing the general store." Yancy's hand tightened imperceptibly around his glass. Pete had been one of the few men in town who hadn't treated him like a leper or a loaded gun about to go off. Pete had even invited him for Sunday dinner once, though Yancy had declined. "Who did it?" he asked, his voice low and graveled with disuse. "Couple of Harkin's boys from the looks of it." "Headed north, I expect." Yancy stood, dropped a coin on the counter and walked out without another word. The sheriff and Silas exchanged a look that said everything. Hell was coming to the Harkin's boys, and there wasn't a force on earth that could stop it. Back at his small cabin on the outskirts of town, Yancy packed methodically. Ammunition, dried meat, canteen, nothing excessive, nothing unnecessary. He'd been a bounty hunter before settling in Redemption Creek, and before that, he'd ridden with the Union Army. War had taught him efficiency. The years after had taught him ruthlessness. By the time dawn broke over the eastern hills, Yancy was already 10 miles out, following tracks that most men would miss. The Harkins brothers weren't known for their intelligence, but they were vicious, responsible for at least 5 deaths across 3 territories. Most lawmen gave them a wide berth. Yancy wasn't most lawmen, and he wasn't driven by the law. He rode for 2 days, stopping only when his horse needed rest. On the evening of the second day, he spotted smoke rising through the trees ahead. Dismounting, he approached on foot, his Colt Navy revolver drawn and ready. The Harkins boys weren't even keeping watch. They sat around their campfire, passing a bottle back and forth, laughing. One of them was counting Money Pete's money, Yancy presumed. The other was cleaning a gun that Yancy recognized as Pete's prized Remington. "Evening, gentlemen," Yancy said, stepping into the firelight, his revolver aimed steady. The Harkins brothers scrambled for their weapons, but Yancy's first shot caught the elder brother in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second brother managed to draw his pistol, but Yancy was faster, putting a bullet through his gun hand. "You've got 2 choices," Yancy said as both men writhed in pain. "You can come back to Redemption Creek to stand trial for Pete Holloway's murder, or you can die right here." "Go to hell," spat the elder Harkins. "After you," Yancy replied, but before he could squeeze the trigger, a voice called out from the darkness. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, mister." Yancy turned slightly, keeping his gun trained on the Harkins brothers while attempting to locate the new voice. A woman stepped into the firelight, a Winchester rifle cradled in her arms. She was tall and straight-backed, with honey-brown hair pulled back in a practical braid and eyes that reflected the dancing flames with an intensity that matched Yancy's own. "These men murdered a friend of mine," Yancy said, not lowering his weapon. "I don't doubt it," she replied, "but killing unarmed, wounded men isn't justice. It's murder. They're armed and dangerous. They're wounded and stupid. There's a difference." For the first time in longer than he could remember, Yancy hesitated. There was something in the woman's voice, not fear, not disgust, but a quiet certainty that made him pause. "I'll help you get them back to town," she offered. "I was heading that way myself." Yancy considered her for a moment, then gave a curt nod. "Tie them up," he instructed. "And don't turn your back on them." The woman produced rope from her pack with practiced ease. "I'm Grace Bellamy," she said as she secured the first Harkins brother's hands behind his back. "Yancy Aldridge." I know who you are, Mr. Aldridge. Your reputation precedes you. Most people hear my name and head the other direction. Grace finished tying the second brother and stood up, brushing dirt from her hands. I'm not most people. That, Yancy could already tell, was an understatement. They traveled through the night, the wounded Harkins brothers secured on their own horses, hands bound, feet tied to the stirrups. Grace rode alongside Yancy, her rifle across her lap, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. You handle yourself like someone who spent time in the wilderness, Yancy observed as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. My father was a surveyor for the railroad, she replied. I grew up moving from camp to camp across the frontier. Learned to shoot, ride, and track before I learned to dance or so. Your father must be proud. A shadow crossed her face. He died 2 years ago, Comanche raid. I'm sorry, don't be. He lived the life he chose. She looked over at him, studying his face in the growing light. Just like you, I expect. Yancy didn't respond, keeping his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. Few people in his life had tried to understand him, and none had succeeded. He wasn't about to let this woman stranger really think she had him figured out. They reached Redemption Creek by mid-afternoon. The town came alive at the sight of the Harkins brothers bound and bleeding, being led down the main street. The sheriff emerged from his office, eyebrows raised in surprise. Didn't expect to see you bringing them in alive, Aldridge, he said. Yancy dismounted, keeping his gun trained on the prisoners. Miss Bellamy here convinced me that justice would be better served by a trial. The sheriff turned his attention to Grace, tipping his hat. Madam, appreciate you keeping our resident avenging angel from adding to his body count. I merely reminded Mr. Aldridge of the difference between justice and vengeance, Grace replied, dismounting with fluid grace. Now, if someone could point me toward the hotel. I've been on the trail for nearly 3 weeks. The sheriff directed her to the modest establishment across the street, and Grace thanked him with a polite nod. Before leaving, she turned to Yancy. Perhaps I'll see you around town, Mr. Aldridge. Yancy gave her a noncommittal grunt, already regretting letting her talk him into bringing the Harkins brothers back alive. He should have put bullets in their heads and been done with it. That's what the old Yancy would have done the Yancy from before the war, before Antietam, before he'd watched his entire unit die in a meaningless charge across an open field. He headed to the saloon, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed him. The townspeople were afraid of him, and rightly so. He'd killed men in this very town, men who'd made the mistake of thinking his quiet demeanor meant weakness. Surprised to see you bringing those boys in breathing, Silas said as he poured Yancy a whiskey. Won't last, Yancy muttered. Judge Harrison will hang them by the end of the week. Still, it's not like you to let someone else do your killing. Yancy downed the whiskey in one swallow, the burn in his throat a welcome distraction from the memory of Grace Bellamy's steady gaze. Pour another, he said, ignoring Silas's comment. 3 whiskeys later, Yancy stepped out onto the boardwalk, the setting sun painting the dusty street in shades of gold and copper. Across the way, he spotted Grace emerging from the hotel, her hair now loose around her shoulders, wearing a clean dress that hugged her figure in a way her riding clothes had not. She saw him watching, and to his surprise, crossed the street directly toward him. Mr. Aldridge, she said, stopping a few feet away. I was hoping to find you. I wanted to thank you properly for listening to reason back at that camp. Wasn't reason, Yancy replied. Just didn't want to have to shoot you too when you inevitably tried to stop me. Rather than take offense, Grace laughed a warm, genuine sound that seemed out of place in this hard-scrabble town. You're not as frightening as you think you are, Mr. Aldridge. Then you're not as smart as you seem, Miss Bellamy. Perhaps not, she conceded with a small smile. Still, I'd like to buy you dinner to show my appreciation. The hotel dining room serves a decent meal, I'm told. Yancy stared at her, trying to discern her angle. Women didn't invite him to dinner. Women crossed to the other side of the street when they saw him coming. Why? He asked bluntly. Because I'm hungry and I dislike eating alone, she replied, equally blunt. And because I think there's more to you than the killer everyone in this town seems to believe you are, you'd be wrong. Prove it then. Have dinner with me and convince me that you're nothing but a cold-blooded killer. It was a challenge, plain and simple, and something in Yancy, something he'd thought long dead, responded to it. "Fine," he said. "One dinner." The hotel dining room fell silent when Yancy entered with Grace. He was accustomed to such reactions, but it clearly made Grace uncomfortable. She straightened her shoulders and led the way to a table in the corner, away from the other diners. "You're causing a scandal," Yancy observed as they sat down. "Dining with the town monster." "Let them talk," Grace replied, opening the menu. "I've never put much stock in the opinions of people who judge without knowing." The waiter approached their table warily, taking their orders with nervous efficiency before hurrying away. "So," Grace said once they were alone again. "What brought you to Redemption Creek, Mr. Aldridge?" "Nothing brought me here, just needed a place to stop." "And you stayed because—" Yancy shrugged. "No reason to move on. No reason to stay either from the looks of it." Grace studied him with those keen eyes. "You don't have any friends here, no family, no business. What keeps a man like you in one place?" "Tired of running," Yancy admitted, surprising himself with the honesty of his answer. Grace nodded slowly. "I understand that. After my father died, I kept moving from place to place, never settling. It was easier than staying somewhere and building a life that could be taken away again." Their food arrived, simple fare of beef stew and bread, and they ate in silence for a few minutes. Yancy found himself watching Grace when she wasn't looking, noticing the small scar near her temple, the calluses on her hands that spoke of hard work, the way she ate with enjoyment but without hurry or waste. "What brings you to Redemption Creek?" he asked finally. "My aunt lives about 20 miles north of here," Grace replied. "She's getting on in years and asked me to come help with her ranch. She runs about 60 head of cattle and can't manage on her own anymore. Ranching is hard work." "So is surviving," Grace said simply. "At least ranching gives you something to show for your efforts." Their conversation continued, stilted at first, but gradually easing into something almost comfortable. Grace told him about growing up on the frontier, about her father's work mapping unexplored territories, about learning to trade with various Indian tribes. Yancy found himself listening more than he had to anyone in years. When dinner was over, he walked her back to her hotel room door, maintaining a respectful distance. "Thank you for the company, Mr. Aldridge," Grace said, her hand on the doorknob. "Yancy," he corrected her. "If we're going to be neighbors, might as well use my name." "Yancy," she repeated with a smile. "And I'm Grace." "Grace," he echoed, the name feeling strange on his tongue. "When do you head out to your aunt's ranch?" "Tomorrow morning. I've hired a wagon to transport some supplies." Yancy nodded, an idea forming that he immediately tried to dismiss. But something, perhaps the whiskey from earlier, perhaps the first real conversation he'd had in months, made him speak. "I could ride with you. Territory between here and there isn't always safe." Grace's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Are you offering to be my escort, Yancy?" "Just being neighborly." Her lips curved into a knowing smile. "Then I accept your neighborly offer. I'll meet you at the general store at 8. Yancy nodded and turned to leave, but Grace called after him. "And Yancy, thank you, for dinner and for tomorrow." He gave her a brief nod and walked away, wondering what the hell he was doing. Escorting a woman to her aunt's ranch, playing protector. It wasn't like him, not the him he'd become anyway. Back in his cabin, Yancy lay on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in years, his thoughts weren't filled with blood and gunsmoke. Instead, he kept seeing Grace's face in the lamplight, hearing her laugh, feeling the strange pull of connection he'd thought himself no longer capable of experiencing. Morning came, and with it, a sense of restlessness that drove Yancy to the general store a full half-hour before the arranged meeting time. He helped the store owner load supplies into the wagon Grace had hired, ignoring the man's surprised looks. At precisely 8 o'clock, Grace arrived, dressed again in practical riding clothes, her hair braided and tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat. She smiled when she saw Yancy already waiting. "Eager to start our journey," she teased. "Eager to get it over with," he replied, but without his usual edge. They set out under a clear blue sky, Grace driving the wagon while Yancy rode alongside on his horse. The road north of Redemption Creek wound through rolling hills dotted with pine and aspen, following the course of a small river. It was beautiful country, though Yancy had never really noticed before. "How did you end up in this line of work?" Grace asked after they'd been traveling for about an hour. "Bounty hunting, I mean." Yancy was silent for so long that Grace thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "Was good at killing during the war. Figured I might as well get paid for it after." "That's not an answer, that's an excuse," Grace replied, unfazed by his bluntness. "Lots of men fought in the war, most didn't become bounty hunters." Yancy shot her an irritated glance. "What do you want me to say? That I enjoy it, that hunting men gives me purpose?" "I want you to tell me the truth. The truth." Yancy couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked him for that, or the last time he'd offered it freely. "My family was killed while I was away fighting," he said finally, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. "Raiders came through our town in Missouri. By the time I got back, there was nothing left, no one left." Grace's hands tightened on the reins. "I'm sorry. Don't be. Like you said about your father, they lived the lives they chose. That doesn't make the loss any easier to bear." No, it didn't. But Yancy had found that bearing unbearable things was possible if you simply stopped feeling anything at all. They traveled on, the conversation shifting to less personal topics: the weather, the condition of the trail, the best routes through the mountains to the west. Around midday, they stopped by the river to rest the horses and eat a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and dried apples. "Tell me about your aunt," Yancy said as they sat in the dappled shade of a cottonwood tree. "Aunt Martha is my mother's sister," Grace explained. "She came west with her husband about 20 years ago. When he died of pneumonia 5 years back, everyone expected her to sell the ranch and move east. Instead, she hired 2 hands and kept the place running herself." "Sounds like stubbornness runs in your family," Grace laughed. "Some might call it determination, but yes, the Bellamy women aren't known for backing down from a challenge. And the ranch is profitable, modest but sustainable from what I understand. The railroad's expansion has created new markets for beef, and Aunt Martha's been smart about breeding stock." Yancy nodded, impressed despite himself. Running a ranch was hard enough for a man with hired hands. For a woman alone, it was nearly impossible. They packed up and continued their journey, the sun warm on their backs, the air fragrant with pine and wild sage. By mid-afternoon, they crested a hill and saw below them a neat ranch nestled in a small valley. A 2-story house of weathered wood stood near a large barn and corral with several smaller outbuildings scattered nearby. In the distance, cattle grazed on green pastures. "That's it," Grace said, a note of wonder in her voice. "Bellamy Ranch." As they approached, a woman emerged from the house, tall and straight-backed despite her years, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. She shaded her eyes against the sun, watching their approach, then raised a hand in greeting when she recognized Grace. "That's Aunt Martha," Grace said, waving back. "She looks well, thank goodness." They pulled up to the house, and Martha Bellamy came down the steps to meet them, her face breaking into a broad smile. "Grace, my dear, I was beginning to think you'd changed your mind." Grace jumped down from the wagon and embraced her aunt warmly. "Nothing could have kept me away, Aunt Martha. The journey just took longer than expected." Martha turned her attention to Yancy, who had dismounted and was standing a respectful distance away. "And who is this handsome escort you've brought with you?" "Yancy Aldridge," Grace introduced him. "He kindly offered to accompany me from Redemption Creek." Martha extended her hand, which Yancy took after a moment's hesitation. "Any friend of Grace's is welcome at Bellamy Ranch, Mr. Aldridge." "Just passing through," Yancy said, uncomfortable with the warmth of Martha's greeting. "I'll head back to town now that Miss Bellamy is safely delivered." "Nonsense," Martha declared. "It's nearly evening, you'll stay for dinner at the very least, and I insist you spend the night." "The journey back to town can wait until morning." Yancy looked to Grace, who smiled encouragingly. "My aunt's cooking is worth staying for, I promise you." Against his better judgment, Yancy found himself accepting the invitation. While Grace and Martha went inside to catch up, Yancy took care of the horses and helped unload the wagon, working alongside one of Martha's ranch hands, a weathered Mexican man named Eduardo who spoke little but worked hard. By the time Yancy entered the house, following Eduardo's directions to wash up at the pump out back first, The aroma of roasting meat and fresh bread filled the air. The interior of the ranch house was neat and comfortable, with well-worn furniture, colorful quilts, and shelves lined with more books than Yancy had seen outside of a proper library. Grace emerged from the kitchen, wearing a simple blue dress, her hair loose around her shoulders. "Ah, there you are. Dinner's almost ready. Would you like something to drink? Aunt Martha makes her own apple cider." Before Yancy could answer, Martha herself appeared, carrying a tray with glasses. "Cider for everyone," she announced. "And Grace, show Mr. Aldridge to the sitting room while I finish up in the kitchen." The sitting room turned out to be a cozy space with a stone fireplace, 2 comfortable armchairs, and a small sofa. Bookshelves lined one wall, and a writing desk stood beneath a window that looked out over the pastures. "Your aunt has quite a collection," Yancy observed, scanning the book titles. "She was a school teacher back east before she married," Grace explained. "Reading has always been her passion. She taught me to read before I was 5. Yancy moved closer to the shelves, his eyes catching on familiar titles: Shakespeare, Dickens, Homer. He reached out and touched the spine of the Iliad. "You know it?" Grace asked, watching him. "Read it during the war," Yancy replied. "One of the few books that circulated among the men in my unit. A story of war and rage," Grace mused. "Fitting, I suppose. And loss," Yancy added quietly. "Always loss." Their eyes met, and for a moment, Yancy felt exposed, as if Grace could see straight through the walls he'd built around himself over the years. Martha's call to dinner broke the moment, and Yancy followed Grace to the dining room, where a feast awaited them: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and vegetables from Martha's garden. "Eduardo shot the steer last week," Martha explained as she served the meat. "We've been enjoying it for several days now. It looks delicious," Grace said. "I can't remember the last time I had a home-cooked meal like this." The conversation flowed easily through dinner, with Martha and Grace doing most of the talking while Yancy ate quietly, observing their interaction. The affection between aunt and niece was obvious, and Martha's sharp intelligence and dry humor reminded him of Grace. After dinner, Martha insisted on showing Grace around the ranch house, pointing out changes and improvements since her last visit. Yancy stepped outside, needing a moment alone. The night air was cool, the sky above brilliant with stars. In the distance, he could hear the low lowing of cattle and the occasional stamp of horses in the corral. Beautiful, isn't it? Yancy turned to find Grace standing a few feet away, her silhouette outlined against the lamplight from the house. "Been a while since I stopped to notice," he admitted. She moved to stand beside him, close but not touching. "What will you do when you return to town tomorrow?" "Same as always. Wait for the next bounty notice or the next fool looking for trouble." "Is that really how you want to spend your life, waiting for opportunities to kill?" The bluntness of her question caught him off guard. "What I want stopped mattering a long time ago." "I don't believe that," Grace said softly. "I think you've just convinced yourself it's easier not to want anything." Yancy looked down at her, this woman who'd known him for all of 2 days yet seemed determined to unravel him. "And what about you? What do you want?" "A home," she said without hesitation. "Somewhere to belong, people to care for who care for me in return, purpose." "Simple things," Yancy said, not unkindly. "The most important things usually are." Grace turned to face him fully. "Aunt Martha has asked me to stay permanently, to take over the ranch when she can no longer manage it. I've decided to accept." "Congratulations," Yancy said, meaning it. "You'll do well here." "Thank you." She hesitated, then added, "The ranch needs more help than just Eduardo and me." Aunt Martha let the other hand go last month, couldn't afford to keep him on. Yancy stiffened, suddenly understanding where this conversation was heading. "If you're about to offer me a job, save your breath. I'm not a rancher." "Have you ever tried?" Grace challenged. "Or have you just decided that killing is all you're good for?" "You don't know what you're talking about," Yancy growled, anger flaring. "You don't know me." "I know enough," Grace said, unflinching in the face of his anger. "I know you're a man running from his past, trying to drown his pain in violence. I know you're better than that. I saw it when you spared those Harkins brothers." "That was your doing, not mine." "No," Grace shook her head. "You were looking for an excuse not to kill them. I just gave you one." Yancy turned away, uncomfortable with her perception. I'm leaving at first light, he said firmly. This isn't my place, Grace sighed. As you wish, but the offer stands should you ever change your mind. She returned to the house, leaving Yancy alone with the stars and his thoughts, which were more turbulent than they'd been in years. True to his word, Yancy rose before dawn the next morning. He found Martha already awake, brewing coffee in the kitchen. Early riser, she commented, pouring him a cup without asking. Grace is the same way, must come from life on the trail. Yancy accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. I should get going, without breakfast. I don't think so. Martha began cracking eggs into a bowl. Sit down, Mr. Aldridge. Food before journeys is one of my rules. Knowing better than to argue with a determined woman, Yancy sat at the kitchen table, cradling his coffee cup between his hands. Grace told me about her offer, Martha said as she worked, and about your refusal. Yancy said nothing. She has good instincts about people, Martha continued, undeterred by his silence. Always has. When she was just a girl, she brought home a half-wild Mustang everyone else had given up on, said the horse just needed someone to believe in him. Within a month, that horse was following her around like a puppy. I'm not a horse that needs taming, Yancy said dryly. Martha laughed, a rich, throaty sound. No, you're a man who needs reminding. Of what? That there's more to life than death. Martha poured beaten eggs into a hot skillet. My husband was like you when I met him. Came back from fighting Mexicans down in Texas all hollowed out, convinced he had nothing left to offer the world but violence. Despite himself, Yancy asked, what changed him? Love, Martha said simply, flipping the eggs. Not just mine, though that helped. Love for the land, for the work, for the life we built together. It gave him something to live for instead of merely something to die for. Yancy stared into his coffee. Some men can't be saved. True enough, Martha conceded. But those men don't usually escort young women safely to their destinations, or bring in criminals alive when they could have shot them dead, or sit in kitchens drinking coffee with old women at dawn. Before Yancy could respond, footsteps on the stairs announced Grace's arrival. She entered the kitchen in her riding clothes, her hair once again braided back. Good morning, she said, her eyes meeting Yancy's briefly before moving to her aunt. Something smells delicious. Just eggs and bacon, Martha replied. Sit down, both of you, food's ready. They ate breakfast as the sky lightened outside, casting a golden glow through the kitchen windows. Yancy found himself studying Grace when she wasn't looking the way the morning light caught in her hair, the small smile that played at the corners of her mouth as she listened to her aunt's stories, the capable strength in her hands as she buttered her bread. After breakfast, he helped Eduardo saddle his horse while Grace loaded him a pack of food for the journey Aunt Martha insists, she'd said, though Yancy suspected it was as much Grace's idea as her aunt's. As he prepared to mount up, Grace approached him one last time. Safe journey, Yancy, she said, holding out her hand. He took it, surprised by the firmness of her grip. Take care of yourself, Grace. The offer still stands, she said, her eyes serious, if you ever want something different. Yancy nodded once, then mounted his horse and rode away without looking back. He told himself it was better this way for her, certainly, and probably for him too. A man like him had no business contemplating a life with a woman like Grace Bellamy. The ride back to Redemption Creek seemed longer than the journey out, though Yancy made good time, arriving by mid-afternoon. The town looked exactly as he'd left it, dusty, small, indifferent to his presence. He stabled his horse and headed straight for the saloon, ordering a whiskey and taking it to his usual corner table. Thought you might have moved on, Silas commented as he brought Yancy a second drink. Why would I do that? Silas shrugged. Saw you riding out with that Bellamy woman. Figured maybe you'd found greener pastures. Just escorting her to her aunt's ranch, Yancy muttered. Nothing more. If you say so, Silas replied, clearly unconvinced. Judge Harrison's coming in tomorrow, by the way. Harkin's brothers will hang day after. Yancy nodded, unsurprised. Justice in the territories was swift and final. He should have felt satisfaction knowing that Pete Holloway's killers would soon face their punishment, but he felt nothing but a vague emptiness. Days passed, turning into weeks. The Harkins brothers hanged as expected. Yancy witnessed the execution from the back of the crowd, his face expressionless as the trap doors opened and the men dropped, their necks snapping with audible cracks. Afterward, he returned to his cabin and cleaned his guns, waiting for the familiar calm that usually came with justice served. It didn't come. Instead, he found himself restless, unable to settle into his usual routine of waiting, drinking, occasionally taking on a bounty when the money ran low. His thoughts kept returning to Bellamy Ranch, to the quiet valley with its green pastures and neat buildings, to Martha's kitchen filled with the scent of coffee at dawn, to Grace's steady gaze and challenging words. A month after his return, Yancy rode out of town again, not north toward Bellamy Ranch, but east, following rumors of a bank robber hiding in the hills. He tracked the man for 3 days, finally cornering him in a remote cabin. The robber drew his gun, and Yancy shot him through the heart without hesitation. As he stared down at the dead man, barely more than a boy, really, with wispy attempts at a beard and cheap, ill-fitting clothes, Yancy felt something inside him crack. This wasn't justice. This wasn't even vengeance. It was just death, meaningless and empty. He collected the bounty in the next town over, then sat in another anonymous saloon, drinking another whiskey that tasted like all the rest. A saloon girl approached, offering company for the night, but he waved her away, not wanting false comfort any more than he wanted false purpose. 3 days later, Yancy rode back into Redemption Creek, dusty and tired. He went straight to the sheriff's office and handed over his bounty hunter's license. "What's this about, Aldridge?" the sheriff asked, bewildered. "I'm done," Yancy said simply. "Done, just like that, just like that." The sheriff studied him, then shook his head slowly. "Well, I can't say I'm sorry to see you out of that line of work. What will you do instead?" Yancy hadn't planned to answer, hadn't really planned anything beyond stopping the killing, but he heard himself say, "Ranching, maybe." The words hung in the air between them, surprising both men equally. The sheriff recovered first, a knowing look crossing his face. "Bellamy Ranch is about a day's ride north," he said casually. "I hear they're looking for help." Yancy didn't respond, just turned and walked out, his steps taking him to his cabin where he began to pack his few possessions. By nightfall, he had sold his cabin to a passing traveler for less than it was worth, but more than he needed. At dawn, he rode north, leaving Redemption Creek behind without a backward glance. The journey to Bellamy Ranch seemed shorter this time, the familiar landmarks appearing sooner than he expected. As he crested the final hill and saw the valley spread out below, a strange feeling took hold in his chest, not quite peace, but perhaps the possibility of it. He rode down to the ranch house where Eduardo was mending a fence nearby. The ranch hand looked up at Yancy's approach, recognition dawning on his weathered face. "Senor Aldridge," he greeted with a nod. "You have come back. Is Miss Bellamy around?" Yancy asked, dismounting. "In the barn," Eduardo replied, gesturing with his hammer. With the new foal. Yancy led his horse toward the large barn, his heart beating faster than the situation warranted. He found Grace inside, kneeling beside a newborn foal, gently stroking its neck while the mare watched protectively. She looked up at the sound of his footsteps, her eyes widening in surprise. "Yancy, the offer still open?" he asked without preamble. Grace stood slowly, brushing straw from her skirt. "The job offer? Yes." She studied him, her expression unreadable. "What changed your mind?" Yancy looked away, then forced himself to meet her gaze. "Got tired of taking life. Thought I might try sustaining it for a change." A slow smile spread across Grace's face, lighting her eyes in a way that made Yancy's chest tighten. "Well, in that case, yes, the offer is still open." "I don't know much about ranching," he admitted. "You'll learn," Grace said confidently. "Eduardo's a good teacher and so is Aunt Martha." "And you?" Yancy asked, taking a step closer to her. "I'm still learning myself," Grace replied, not backing away. "But I'm told I have a gift for taming wild things." The corner of Yancy's mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "So I've heard." Life at Bellamy Ranch settled into a rhythm that Yancy found both challenging and unexpectedly satisfying. He worked from sunrise to sunset, learning the business of cattle and horses, of fences and feed, of birth and growth rather than death and decay. Eduardo proved to be a patient teacher, showing Yancy how to rope calves, how to predict the weather from the behavior of the cattle, how to mend fences and build corrals that would last. Martha taught him about the business side of ranching markets and prices, breeding records and cattle bloodlines, and Grace taught him how to live again. They worked side by side most days, their initial wariness giving way to a comfortable partnership. Yancy found himself talking more than he had in years, sharing thoughts and opinions, even occasional memories of his life before the war. Grace listened without judgment, offering her own stories in return. One evening, about 2 months after Yancy's arrival, he and Grace were returning to the ranch house after checking on a pregnant mare in the far pasture. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, the air cooling as twilight approached. Do you ever miss it? Grace asked suddenly. The excitement of bounty hunting, Yancy considered the question seriously. Not the killing, he said finally, but sometimes I miss the clarity of it. Right and wrong were simpler then. Are they so complicated now? Now I have to think about the future, Yancy admitted. About building something that will last. That's harder than tearing things down, Grace nodded, understanding in her eyes. But worth it, I think. Yes, Yancy agreed, surprising himself with how much he meant it. Worth it. They reached the barn and began unsaddling their horses, working in companionable silence. As Yancy lifted his saddle onto its stand, he felt Grace's eyes on him. What? He asked, turning to face her. You've changed, she observed. There's less fury in you now. Yancy moved closer, drawn by something in her voice. And you think that's a good thing? I do, Grace said softly, not moving away as he stepped nearer. Though I never feared your anger, Yancy, only the pain beneath it. They stood close now, close enough that Yancy could see the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes, could smell the lavender soap she used in her hair. Grace, he said, his voice rough with emotion he'd long suppressed. I'm not good at this. At what? She asked, though her eyes suggested she already knew, feeling, he admitted. Wanting things, people. Perhaps you just need practice, Grace suggested, her lips curving into a smile that made Yancy's heart race. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Yancy reached up to touch her cheek. Her skin was warm and soft beneath his calloused fingers. When she leaned into his touch, eyes closing briefly, Yancy felt something inside him break open, not painfully, but like a dam releasing after years of holding back. He bent his head and kissed her, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as Grace's arms came up around his neck, her body pressing closer to his. It was a homecoming of sorts, this kiss a return to a part of himself he'd thought lost forever. When they finally broke apart, both breathing harder than before, Grace looked up at him with bright eyes and flushed cheeks. Well, she said, her voice a touch unsteady, it seems you haven't forgotten everything about living. Yancy laughed a real laugh, rusty from disuse but genuine. Apparently not. Their relationship evolved naturally after that, growing deeper with each passing day. They worked together by day and talked by night, sitting on the porch watching the stars, or by the fire in Martha's sitting room, surrounded by books. Martha observed their growing closeness with obvious approval, though she refrained from commenting directly. Eduardo was less subtle, winking at Yancy whenever he and Grace rode out together, making the former bounty hunter roll his eyes but not deny the Mexican's implied assumptions. Summer turned to fall, and the ranch prepared for winter. Yancy threw himself into the preparations, helping to harvest the last of the garden crops, repair buildings before the snow came, ensure the livestock had adequate shelter and feed stored. One crisp October morning, Yancy rode out with Eduardo to check the northern fence line, which had been damaged during a recent storm. They worked in companionable silence for several hours, replacing posts and mending wire. You will ask her soon, she. Eduardo asked suddenly as they paused for water. Ask who what? Yancy replied, though he knew perfectly well what the ranch hand meant. Eduardo gave him a knowing look. Señorita Grace to marry before Christmas, I think. Yancy shook his head, though the idea had been growing in his mind for weeks now. What makes you so sure she'd say yes? Eduardo laughed. Her eyes when she looks at you, same as your eyes when you look at her. Yancy felt heat rise to his face, unused to discussing such personal matters. It's not that simple. Life is never simple, Eduardo shrugged. But love is the simplest thing there is. You feel it or you don't. You act on it or you don't. Put that way, it did seem straightforward. Yancy loved Grace, had loved her, he suspected, since that night at the Harkins brothers' camp when she'd stood up to him with her Winchester and her unwavering principles. The question wasn't whether he loved her, but whether he deserved her, whether he had any right to offer her a future with a man whose hands were stained with so much blood. They finished the fence repairs and rode back to the ranch as dusk was falling. In the distance, Yancy could see smoke rising from the chimney of the ranch house, lamplight glowing in the windows. It looked like a painting of home, the kind of home he'd never thought to have again. Grace was in the barn when they returned, finishing up the evening feeding. She looked up with a smile as Yancy entered, her face illuminated by the warm glow of the lantern she carried. "How was the fence line?" she asked, setting down a bucket of oats. "Fixed," Yancy replied, taking the lantern from her to hang it on a hook. "Should hold through the winter." "Good." "Aunt Martha's made stew for dinner. She sent me to fetch you both." Eduardo excused himself to wash up, leaving Yancy and Grace alone in the lantern-lit barn. Yancy caught her hand as she turned to leave. "Grace," he said, suddenly serious, "I need to ask you something." She turned back, eyebrows raised in question. "What is it?" Words had never been Yancy's strong suit, so he reached into his pocket instead, pulling out a small object he'd been carrying for days now. It was a ring, simple silver set with a small blue stone that he'd purchased on his last trip into town for supplies. Grace's eyes widened as she saw what he held. "Yancy, I love you," he said, the words coming out gruff but sincere. "Have for a while now. Don't deserve you, but if you'll have me anyway, I'd like to make it official." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Are you asking me to marry you, Yancy Aldridge? Doing a poor job of it, but yes." Grace laughed through her tears, holding out her left hand. "Then my answer is yes." Yancy slid the ring onto her finger, his own hand steadier than he'd expected. When he looked up, Grace was watching him with such love in her eyes that it took his breath away. "You're wrong, you know," she said softly, stepping closer to him. "About what?" "About not deserving me." She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the lines that worry and hardship had carved there. "You're a good man, Yancy. You always were. You just forgot for a while." He pulled her close then, holding her against his heart, marveling at how someone so full of light could love someone who'd spent so long in darkness. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair. "For what?" "For seeing something in me worth saving." Grace leaned back to look at him, her eyes serious. "I didn't save you, Yancy. You saved yourself. I just reminded you that it was possible." They were married on Christmas Eve, in the ranch house decorated with pine boughs and candles. The local preacher came out from town to perform the ceremony, and a few neighbors joined them for the occasion. Martha wept openly, while Eduardo beamed with satisfaction, as if the match had been his idea all along. Grace wore a dress of deep blue silk that Martha had ordered from Denver, with the blue stone ring gleaming on her finger. Yancy wore a new black suit that felt stiff and formal, but he forgot his discomfort the moment Grace appeared on Martha's arm, radiant with happiness. They spoke their vows simply and sincerely, promising to love and honor each other for the rest of their days. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Yancy kissed Grace with a tenderness that belied his former reputation as a man of violence. Winter passed in a haze of newfound domestic happiness. Yancy and Grace moved into a small cabin on the property that had originally been built for the foreman when the ranch was larger. They spent the cold evenings planning for the future improvements to the ranch, possibilities for expanding their herd, dreams of children someday. Spring brought new calves and foals, fresh grass in the pastures, and the news that Martha had decided to formally deed half the ranch to Grace and Yancy. "It's time," she insisted when they protested. "I'm not getting any younger, and I want to see you two make this place truly your own while I'm still around to enjoy it." So Bellamy Ranch became Bellamy Aldridge Ranch, a name that still made Yancy shake his head in wonder. A man like him, with land and a wife and a future stretched out before him like the endless Wyoming sky. The transformation wasn't instantaneous or without setbacks. There were nights when Yancy woke in a cold sweat, the ghosts of his past visiting in dreams. There were days when the weight of his former life pressed down on him, making him withdraw into silence. But Grace was always there, patient and understanding, neither pushing him to talk nor allowing him to retreat completely. She had a way of drawing him back to the present, back to her, with a touch or a word or simply her presence beside him. And there were joys he'd never anticipated: the satisfaction of watching a calf he'd helped deliver grow strong and healthy, the pleasure of rebuilding the old corral with his own hands, the simple contentment of sitting with Grace on their porch in the evening, watching the sun set over land that was partly theirs. One night, about a year after their wedding, as they lay together in the darkness of their bedroom, Grace took Yancy's hand and placed it over her abdomen. "We're going to have a child," she whispered. Yancy went still, overwhelmed by emotions he couldn't name. "You're sure?" "The doctor in town confirmed it today. By winter, we'll be 3 instead of 2. Yancy pulled her close, burying his face in her hair to hide the tears that sprang to his eyes. A child. His child. A new life that would know nothing of the man he'd once been, only the man he was becoming. "Are you happy?" Grace asked, her voice holding a trace of uncertainty. "More than I ever thought possible," Yancy replied honestly. "More than I ever deserved to be." "There you go again, talking about deserving," Grace chided gently. "Life isn't about what we deserve, Yancy. It's about what we choose." And he had chosen to follow Grace that day, chosen to leave behind the path of violence, chosen love over vengeance, life over death. It wasn't always an easy choice, but looking at his wife in the moonlight filtering through their window, feeling the promise of new life beneath his hand, Yancy knew it was the only choice that mattered. Their daughter was born on a snowy December night, with Martha and the midwife attending while Yancy paced outside the bedroom door, more terrified than he'd ever been facing down armed outlaws. When at last the midwife called him in, he entered to find Grace pale but radiant, holding a small bundle wrapped in one of Martha's quilts. "Come meet your daughter," Grace said softly. Yancy approached the bed cautiously, as if afraid his mere presence might somehow taint this perfect new being. Grace pulled back the quilt to reveal a tiny face, eyes closed, wispy dark hair dusting a perfect head. "Would you like to hold her?" Grace asked. Yancy hesitated, looking down at his hands that had taken so many lives. "I don't know how." "Like this," Grace demonstrated, then carefully transferred the baby into his arms. The child was lighter than he'd expected, and warmer. As he cradled her awkwardly, her eyes fluttered open dark blue now, but Grace said they might change and seemed to look directly into his. In that moment, Yancy Aldridge, once feared bounty hunter and gunslinger, felt his heart crack wide open, pouring out everything he'd kept contained for so long: love, fear, hope, gratitude, a flood of emotions so powerful he could barely breathe through it. "What shall we name her?" Grace asked, watching the two of them with tender eyes. Yancy thought for a moment, then said, "Hope. I'd like to call her Hope." Grace smiled, reaching out to touch first her daughter's cheek, then her husband's. "Hope Bellamy Aldridge, it's perfect." And it was perfect, not just the name, but the life they were building together. Not without challenges, certainly, but full of purpose and meaning that Yancy had never found in the barrel of a gun, years past. Hope grew from a baby to a toddler to a spirited young girl, who rode almost as soon as she could walk, and had her mother's determined chin and her father's watchful eyes. Martha remained a vital part of their lives, though she gradually ceded more responsibility for the ranch to Yancy and Grace, preferring to spend her days tending her garden and teaching Hope her letters. The ranch prospered under their joint care, expanding to nearly twice its original size. They hired more hands, built new outbuildings, and established a reputation for quality stock that brought buyers from as far away as Denver. Yancy's past was not forgotten. Occasionally, someone would pass through who recognized him from his bounty hunting days, and there were always whispers when they went into town. But such occurrences grew rarer as time passed, and the man Yancy had been receded further into memory, replaced by the rancher, husband, and father he'd become. One evening, as summer was giving way to fall in Hope's 7th year, the family sat on the porch watching the sunset. Hope was perched on the railing, Martha in her rocking chair, and Grace leaning against Yancy's shoulder on the bench they'd built together. "Papa," Hope said suddenly, turning her serious gaze on her father. "Jimmy Mason in town says you used to kill bad men for money. Is that true?" Yancy felt Grace tense beside him. They'd never hidden his past from Hope, but neither had they volunteered details inappropriate for a child's ears. "I was a bounty hunter once," Yancy acknowledged, meeting his daughter's eyes. "That means I tracked down men who had broken the law." "Did you kill them?" Hope pressed with the direct curiosity of childhood. Yancy considered how to answer, then decided on simple truth. "Sometimes when I had to. It's not something I'm proud of, Hope. Why did you stop?" Yancy looked at Grace, his heart full of all she had brought into his life. "I met your mother," he said softly, "and she showed me there were better ways to live." Hope seemed to consider this, her young face solemn. "I'm glad you stopped," she said finally. "I like you better as a rancher." Yancy laughed, reaching out to ruffle his daughter's hair. "So do I, Pumpkin, so do I." Later that night, after Hope was asleep and Martha had retired to her room, Yancy and Grace stood together at the window of their bedroom, looking out at the moon-silvered landscape of their ranch. "You handled Hope's questions well," Grace said, leaning back against Yancy's chest as his arms encircled her waist. "Wasn't sure how much to tell her. You told her what she needed to know. The rest can wait until she's older." Yancy nodded, resting his chin atop Grace's head. "Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever truly leave that life behind." "You already have," Grace said firmly. "The past doesn't disappear, Yancy, but it doesn't have to define you either." She turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to touch the silver now threading through his dark hair, the lines of laughter that had joined the lines of hardship around his eyes. "When I met you, you were all fury and silence," she said softly. "Now look at you, a man at peace with himself and his life." "You're doing," Yancy murmured, bending to kiss her. Grace smiled against his lips. "Our doing," she corrected. "Some things require partnership." As they stood there in the moonlight, holding each other close, Yancy marveled at the journey that had brought him from the blood-soaked battlefields of the war, through years of vengeance and emptiness, to this quiet moment of contentment. He had found peace at last, not in the silence of death or the numbness of whiskey, but in the laughter of his daughter, the wisdom of his wife, and the life they had built together on this land that had become truly home. The man he had been would always be part of him, but it was no longer all of him. Thanks to Grace and the love she had shown him, Yancy Aldridge had become more than his past, more than his sins. He had become a man worthy of the future stretching bright before them, rich with possibility and hope. And in the end, that was the greatest piece of all.